Welcome back. It's good to see you again. In our last couple of lectures, we've been spending our time back in India, but today we're returning to China and then moving slowly to Japan. We're going to be exploring the Chan or Zen tradition. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me because sometimes things will get a little bit abstract and a little bit complex, and you might begin to lose the sense that we're really talking about the meaning of life. But we are. And I promise you that if we really focus on some of these abstract details, all will become clear. Zen is notoriously a bit obscure, but my hope is that by moving methodically and clearly, we can actually make this transparent and revealing, because to my mind, the Zen tradition is one of the more profound and beautiful developments of philosophy in the history of humankind. So far, we've examined two main strands of thought about the meaningful life that are going to come together in Chan, as it's called in Chinese, or Zen, as it's called in Japanese. The first is the Taoist tradition from China, and the second is the Indian Mahayana Buddhist tradition. Now, we've already seen that the Taoist tradition, which is indigenously Chinese, places a great deal of emphasis on nature, on our own human nature, and on the dangers imposed by cultivation, the accretion of social forms, language, conceptuality, and so forth, and emphasizes the need, in order to lead a life worth living, to pare down rather than to build up, to eliminate all of those accretions, and a real emphasis on the development of spontaneity. We've also seen in Taoism a real suspicion of rational thought, of reason, of rules, and of discipline, in favor, again, of a spontaneous perceptual engagement with reality. Now, in the Indian Mahayana Buddhist tradition, we've seen some very different themes, some of which we might expect to be in tension with some of these Taoist ideas, and indeed there will be some creative tension. In the Indian tradition, we had an emphasis on the interdependence of phenomena, on the fact that everything arises in dependence on countless causes and conditions, that each of our actions, each of our perceptions, each of our thoughts, and every moment of our experience is interdependent on countless many causes and conditions, some of which are within us, some of which are outside. We saw an emphasis on the development of compassion, and we saw the thesis developed that compassion is a natural outgrowth of rational analysis. So in the Indian Buddhist tradition, rather than a suspicion of reason and rational analysis, we had a valorization of reason as our guide to understanding the fundamental nature of reality, and a conviction that once we understand the fundamental nature of reality, compassion emerges quite naturally. And we saw that compassion and reason were proposed jointly as the solutions to the problem of suffering, because suffering on this view, the meaningless life, is grounded in this primal confusion about the nature of reality that gives rise to attraction and aversion. Reason eliminates that confusion. When attraction and aversion drop off, compassion arises with the awareness of interdependence. Now, Buddhism was always a missionary tradition. It was a tradition in which Buddhist monks and later nuns went out to spread the Buddhist word, first all over India, then into Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, then up into China, later into Tibet, off into East Asia, and of course in our own day, all over the world. Oftentimes, when Buddhism entered a culture, it entered a culture that was not a fully scholastic literary culture, and Buddhism could work its magic on that culture. That's the case, for instance, in Tibet, where there was no literacy, very little scholastic tradition at all, a very primitive religious tradition. And when Buddhism came in, it really resulted in a wholesale import of the high medieval Buddhist culture of India. But when Buddhism entered China, things were very, very different, because China, of course, was already a very old civilization with well-developed philosophical and religious traditions in Taoism and Confucianism. And so when Buddhism entered, it was always interpreted through the lenses of Taoism and Confucianism. And when Buddhism was translated into Chinese, it was translated into a language that was already rich with philosophical resonance. And so when we see Buddhism coming into China, we see not only Chinese civilization transformed by Buddhism, but more importantly, Buddhism sinified, made Chinese, and partly through this kind of interfusion with ideas that we will recognize as Taoist and sometimes Confucian ideas. That'll be the project. So our program for today is going to run roughly as follows. I'm going to begin with a brief history of the Chan or Zen tradition. Once again, Chan is the Chinese pronunciation, Zen is the Japanese. And by the way, Chan is the Chinese pronunciation of a Sanskrit word, jnana, awareness, or meditation. And so it's the meditation tradition. Then we'll talk about some of the distinctive features of Zen within the Buddhist world. Talk a little bit about the nature of impermanence and the way that that is reconceived in Zen. Then talk about the relationship between impermanence and our experience of ourself. And we're going to finish with a really pretty Zen poem by the great Zen philosopher Dogen. So as we begin to do a bit of history of the Zen tradition, we're going to talk about that history both from a kind of internal perspective, discussing how the Zen tradition tells its own story, but also we're going to talk about how contemporary scholars of Zen see the tradition from the outside. Let's begin with the inside. Where does Zen actually see itself beginning? It sees itself beginning in a wonderful, beautiful episode in the early history of Buddhism that is recorded in the Pali Canon, in the early discourses of the Buddha. And it's the story of a brief interaction between the Buddha and one of his principal disciples, Mahakasyapa. And it goes like this. The Buddha was sitting before a huge assembly of monks who were waiting, expecting to hear a teaching from the Buddha, because that's what he did a lot. And instead of beginning to speak, the Buddha picked up a single flower and just held it up. Everybody stared, but one monk, Mahakasyapa, smiled. And the story is that at that moment, the Buddha realized that Mahakasyapa understood what he was, well, I can't say talking about, understood what he was communicating. And in the Zen internal tradition, this is the first transmission of Zen, because Zen sees itself as a special transmission that runs through an unbroken lineage of wordless mind-to-mind transmission. So from the Zen point of view, what happened was the Buddha had a realization of the nature about the nature of reality. And the Buddha recognized that that realization could be communicated to somebody who would understand it by merely contemplating that flower. Kasyapa contemplated the flower in the right way and came to understand. Kasyapa passed that realization to his disciples, and so on and so on and so on. And each Zen master now, who is authoritative with respect to teaching, traces his or her own transmission lineage back to that initial episode. Whether the transmission is actually authenticatable is a different story, but every Zen master would take it for granted that his or her transmission lineage goes back to that event and is unbroken. Zen came to China with the great monk Bodhidharma late in the 5th or early in the 6th century of the Common Era. And as I said, it came into a kind of already rich cultural milieu. It's important to note that by that time, not only do we have an already established Confucian and Taoist traditions, which began in China, but we've also got earlier transmissions of Buddhism, because Buddhism began to come into China around the 2nd century. And so for a few hundred years, other Buddhist schools are there. So Zen is a kind of latecomer into China. And Zen had to kind of fight its way in. Bodhidharma emphasized serious long-term sitting meditation called Zazen, just sitting and meditating, and introduced a new sutra into the Chinese milieu, the Lankavatara, or Descent into Lanka Sutra, which became very important. Bodhidharma established a lineage with a succession of patriarchs. He's regarded as the first Chinese patriarch. And then there's a succession of 5 patriarchs in a unified lineage. And then we come to the sixth patriarch, Huineng. And with Huineng, we're going to tell a story. It's a really good Zen story, and it will really bring to life some of what's pregnant in Zen. Huineng, as the story has it, was a kind of rustic country bumpkin woodcutter. And one day he was in the market and he heard a monk reciting a particular sutra, the Diamond Sutra. And he had a sudden realization. He suddenly understood something he hadn't understood before. We don't know the content of the realization. But he asked, where can you go to study this? And he was told to go to the temple of the fifth patriarch where you could study this. So he went and asked for admission, and he was an illiterate country bumpkin. So he was basically put to work in the kitchen pounding rice. And he pounded rice in the kitchen for a number of years. Then the fifth patriarch was getting old and needed to organize his succession. And he organized his succession in the following creative way. He held a poetry contest. We'd now call it a poetry slam, and challenged monks in the monastery to write a poem on a particular wall in the monastery demonstrating their realization. Now, all of the monks assumed that the vice abbot, the principal disciple of the fifth patriarch, named Senshui, was going to win the competition. So nobody even bothered writing a poem. And the wall stayed blank, and the wall stayed blank, and the wall stayed blank. Finally, Xuanzi wrote this poem on the wall. He came up at night when everybody was sleeping, wrote the poem, and it was found in the morning. And Xuanzi's poem goes like this. The body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is a clear mirror. Always strive to polish it, let no dust alight. What does this mean? It's a very straightforward poem. It's a very straightforward poem. When he says the body is the Bodhi tree, he's saying, look, our own physical practice is like the tree under which the Buddha himself gained awakening. That is, it's the physical prop that makes it possible for us to gain awakening. Fair enough. The mind is a clear mirror. Our mind is naturally luminous, and it reflects the nature of reality if only we pay attention to it. So far, so good. Nothing mysterious. And then he says, and we can see the echoes of, say, Confucianism here, always strive to polish it. Keep it really clean. Really work on cultivating it. Remember that Confucian line, cut, ground, polished. Let no dust alight. That is, don't let the afflictions, emotions, delusions, confusion, attraction, and aversion land in your mind. Keep it clean. That's a pretty good poem. That's a pretty good poem. You'd be happy if you wrote that poem for your Zen master, I'll bet. And of course, the fifth patriarch was happy. He said, that's pretty good. The next day, all of the monks came and saw this poem on the wall, and they were all impressed and amazed. And poor old Huineng, who was illiterate, had to ask somebody to read it to him. And another monk read it to him, and he thought. And the next night, Huineng came up to the wall, and he had to bring somebody with him, but he gave dictation and had the following two verses written on the wall right next to Xuanzi's poem. The first verse he wrote was, now let me recall that original poem first. The original poem was, the body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is a clear mirror, always strive to polish it, let no dust alight. So, what did Huineng write? He wrote, Bodhi, that is awakening, originally has no tree. The mirror has no stand. Buddha nature, that is our primordial nature as potentially awakened, is primordially clean and pure. Where could dust even alight? Let's pause on that verse for a minute. When he says Bodhi originally has no tree, he's talking about that body that was supposed to be the Bodhi tree. And he's saying, look, awakening doesn't necessarily depend on our physical being. Awakening depends upon something that's well beyond our ordinary physical nature, primordial nature of our mind. The mirror, the mind, has no stand. That is, don't worry about the ordinary physical world. Be paying attention to experience. Then he says, Buddha nature, that is our ability to attain awakening, is primordially clean and pure. Where could dust alight? What's he saying? He's saying, look, Xuanzi is focused on all of this defilement, on all of these attractions and aversions and all of the things we need to get rid of. those aren't even part of our primordial nature. If we're trying to understand ourselves, then don't pay attention to all of these adventitious things that really aren't so important. And then comes the second verse, which is a wonderful clincher. He says, the mind is the Bodhi tree. That is, the support for our own awakening is the mind itself. The body's a mirror stand. All it's doing is holding up the thing you care about. The mirror, that is the mind, is primordially clean and pure. How could it ever be dusty? So Huineng is asking the question, where do you even find all of these things you want to get rid of? Stop this notion of cultivation. If you simply pay attention to your fundamental nature, you'll understand that you already are fully awakened, already fully, effectively a Buddha. A very, very dramatic line. Now, what happens? Well, the fifth patriarch looks at Huineng's poems and says, you've got it, hands him the robe and bulb and disappears, and Huineng becomes the sixth patriarch. And this school becomes very dominant in Tang and Song Dynasty China. Zen flourishes after this, develops very powerful monasteries that become politically important as well, and produces an enormous literature of philosophical writing, religious writing, poetry, inspires tons of painting, and becomes the tradition that we've come to know and love, and flourishes tremendously in China. In the 12th century, the Japanese monk Eisai comes to China to study, because Japanese and Korean monks all came to China at this point to study Buddhism. And he brought one of the Zen lineages, the so-called Linji lineage, back to Japan, where it became established as what we now know as the Rinzai Zen lineage, one of the two main lineages in Japan. The other main lineage in Japan is Soto. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in a little bit. The Soto lineage, which in Chinese was the Caogon lineage, was brought to Japan in the 14th century by the monk, scholar, and poet Dogen. And we'll be talking about Dogen a bit later on. Zen flourished, of course, in Japan, flourished in Korea, and has become a very important tradition there, generating, again, wonderful literature, profound philosophy, and a lot of very important, powerful temples and beautiful art. And in the 20th century, Zen started coming to the West, first with Suzuki Roshi, and then a series of other great Roshis, great Japanese teachers who have flourished and produced many disciples in the West, where Zen is now very, very well established. That's a brief history. Now, how does Zen see itself? As we said, Zen sees itself as being this kind of special transmission of insight outside of scriptures. As the Zen teachers say, no dependence on word and letters, a direct pointing to the human mind, seeing into one's own nature and attaining Buddhahood. That's a quote from Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma says, don't depend on words and letters. Just Zen is just a pointing to the mind. If you understand your own nature, you attain Buddhahood. So this is the idea that a really fully awakened life, a life worth leading, is a life in which you understand exactly one thing. That is your own nature, the nature of your own mind. And so Zen always sees itself as this kind of non-discursive, non-conceptual tradition, using non-verbal means, like that flower, like slaps and hits and art and poetry, to get people to transform directly, to get people to have a direct insight into their own minds and hence into all of reality. And it's handed from mind to mind, not text to text. So in Zen, we also have this tremendous emphasis on teacher-disciple lineages. And anybody who's a serious Zen practitioner can refer to their teacher, tell you who their teacher's teacher was, and so forth. And these lineages are carefully mapped back to the Buddha himself and the initial moment with Kasyapa. And so we see that we're going to see that the roots of Zen are Indian, and explicitly Indian, but also has this tremendous Taoist infusion. Now, I want to mention, before we go further into some details, some distinctive features of the Chan or Zen tradition. The first we've already mentioned. It has this kind of antinomian character. Zen is suspicious of words, conceptuality, analysis, and logic, and emphasizes direct experience in meditation as opposed to study. So in Zen monasteries, you often see very little philosophical and textual study, but a lot of meditation aimed immediately at self-transformation, and a tremendous focus on the nature of mind. There's a paradox here, of course, because while Zen explicitly in its own self-description eschews textuality and discursivity, it's also produced probably the largest body of texts, literature, poems of any Buddhist tradition. So this paradox is one that's worth keeping in mind. There's a lot of paradoxical things about Zen. It's one of the things that makes it most famous in the West. A lot of Zen training, especially in the Rinzai tradition, hinges upon these puzzles called koans. Famous koans you've probably heard. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Does a dog have Buddha nature? These are meant to be puzzles that are meant to occupy your mind, get you to try to think about them rationally until you realize that rational and discursive thought can't work, leaving you with a sudden insight into the solution of the puzzle that comes from somewhere within you, and understanding that inner process allows you to understand not the answer to the puzzle, but your own mind, how it works and how it sees things. And so this kind of use of paradox, non-discursivity, and koan is all central to Zen. Also central to Zen is this idea that we saw in Huineng's poem of primordial awakening and Buddha nature. The idea that each of us has as our fundamental character this Buddha nature, this primordial capacity to understand ourselves and the world completely, to live in a fully awakened, spontaneous way, and that practice is a matter of recovering or uncovering that Buddha nature. Notice the influence of Taoism here, recovering an original nature rather than creating something else. And finally, in all of Zen, there is a beautifully aesthetic dimension. We're going to encounter that in a short while. And the use of art, painting, calligraphy, poetry, music in Zen has always been part of the tradition, because Zen emphasizes the beauty of the world and the value of seeing beauty as part of what it is to understand the world and to take up with life meaningfully. Now, I said earlier, and we'll now come to that issue, Zen also focuses deeply on the notion of impermanence or momentariness. This idea plays a central role in Zen, much more central than it does even in other Buddhist traditions that emphasize the importance of impermanence. In India, we've already encountered this distinction between gross and subtle impermanence. I'll remind you of that briefly. Things are grossly impermanent when we notice that they change from day to day to day. Our hair gets grayer and we lose some of our hair. The weather changes from sunny to rainy, back to sunny again. Our children get older, leaves fall from trees. We're aware of this kind of impermanence all the time. The second kind of impermanence we encountered was what we called subtle impermanence. And that is the momentary change from moment to moment to moment that is so quick that it escapes our notice, but is the necessary condition of even gross impermanence, that nothing remains the same from moment to moment. Atoms are exchanged, things get a second older every second, things wear down, and so forth. So we've already encountered those. But in Zen, we get this slightly more detailed analysis because we distinguish this kind of metaphysical impermanence, an impermanence in the nature of things, with a phenomenological impermanence. And the idea is this: Zen focuses on our own mind, on our own experience, on the way we take up with the world. And the point is that not only is our own mind impermanent, subtly, that is, our conscious states, our thoughts are changing from moment to moment to moment to moment, never lasting for more than a second. But if we pay attention to our own experience, because our mental states are changing from moment to moment to moment, we are constantly experiencing subtle impermanence. Our own mental states provide us with the foundation for a constant experience of constant change. Every perception we have is constantly changing. As you move your head, at every second, at every microsecond, the field of vision in front of your eyes is changing. The field of sound that you're experiencing changes from moment to moment. And we are experiencing that. But of course, we're not always conscious that we're experiencing it. And so, the Zen analysis of primal confusion, this root of suffering, is this: that while we are constantly experiencing our minds and the world as they are, that is, as subtly impermanent, and we have this phenomenology of impermanence, we ignore the fact that we're experiencing it. We ignore our own experience, masking it with conception, masking it with logic, with discursive thought, with language and with conceptuality and take this constant experience of impermanence and reinterpret it as an experience of constancy and permanence, thus creating a layer between us and not only reality, but between ourselves and our own genuine experience. And so our primordial awakening is constituted by the fact that we are in fact already experiencing reality as it is, which is the foundation of compassion, the foundation of joy, the foundation of understanding ourselves. But we're constantly suppressing that understanding with a layer of conceptuality. Doing that, of course, also suppresses our awareness of death and the significance of that impermanence. And for Zen, that's part of the reason that we do this. Remember the wheel of life that we saw, all in the jaws of death? Because we're afraid of dying, because we're afraid of our impermanence, we tend to suppress that awareness. And even though that we are constantly perceiving impermanence, we conceive permanence in order to forestall that terror. And of course, what that enables us to do by forestalling that is to live in a kind of dream world, a world that's really quite meaningless, a world that's really quite trivial, even though we have the constant reality of a beautiful, impermanent world before our perception all the time. Similarly, our own personal continuum, that is the continuum of our mental states, is constantly dependently originated, constantly impermanent. The Zen claim, the claim when Huineng says there is no mirror, isn't to say that we don't exist. It's to say that there's nothing like a mirror that's constantly permanently there, waiting for dust to come and go. Rather, the mirror itself is constantly changing, constantly transforming, has no existence from moment to moment. We do exist, but we exist as continua, though we grasp ourselves as continuants instead of as continua. We take ourselves to be continuing things, not these sequences. And so what happens is that we perceive our own impermanence and hence our own mortality. It terrifies us. So we reconceive ourselves as permanent and substantial to hold down that fear of death. And in doing that, Zen practitioners think we then alienate ourselves not only from the world, not only from others, but from ourselves as well. And it's only relinquishing this kind of grasping and therefore relinquishing conceptuality, thought, and textuality that we're able to return to that primordial state that gives our lives meaning. And so we see both Indian, Buddhist, and Taoist resonances here, and they're just fraught throughout. But now I promised you a poem, right? I promised you a poem, and it's my favorite Zen poem, so I get to share it with you now. And it's a Zen poem from Dogen, this great Japanese scholar who lost his parents very early in his life and became very obsessed with the notion of impermanence, traveled from Japan to China to learn Chan, and ended up bringing the lineage back to Japan, which became the great Soto lineage. So what does Dogen write in this beautiful poem? He writes, "Being in the world, to what might it be compared? Dwelling in a dewdrop, fallen from a waterfowl's beak, the image of the moon." So Dogen is comparing being in the world, not the world, but our experience, what life is like, the way we lead our lives, really. What's he comparing it to? He's comparing it to the image of the moon in a dewdrop that's just fallen from the waterfowl's beak. It's delicate, it's impermanent, it's unbelievably beautiful though. This idea of the connection between impermanence and beauty is so important. Dogen is pointing out not that the moon in the dewdrop is beautiful despite being impermanent. He's emphasizing that it's beautiful precisely because it's impermanent. And he's also emphasizing that this entire moon, this vast celestial body, is contained in this tiny dewdrop. And what being in the world is like is containing this vastness of reality in perfection and beauty, perfect and beautiful, because it's contained within us, but only momentarily. It's that emphasis on momentariness and beauty that really marks Dogen's thought. So, on this view, impermanence is no tragedy. Impermanence is reality. Death is no tragedy, not a catastrophe. It's part of reality. Impermanence is exactly what makes our existence possible. It's the very nature of our existence. No impermanence, no reality, no existence. If you want a world, you take impermanence. You put it in a dewdrop, dropping from the waterfowl's beak. But it also grounds a very special kind of beauty. In Japanese, there's a lovely term for this, aware, which means the beauty of passing things. The way that cherry blossoms are especially beautiful because they last for such a short time. The way that a flower is especially beautiful just before it fades. And in the Japanese Zen context, this is meant to be the deepest kind of beauty because it's the beauty that reveals impermanence, therefore the beauty that reveals the nature of our minds, therefore the beauty that reveals reality. And we can only experience this reality if we grasp and celebrate impermanence. That's what gives our lives a meaning. That's what gives them aesthetic meaning. That's what gives them value because we actually care about those moments, noticing how few they are. And that's what gives them contact with the reality that we live in because it doesn't superimpose a false conception of permanence on this, but interacts with the world and ourselves just as we are. This, of course, deepens a lot of ideas that we've already encountered, both from India and from China, but also you'll notice from Stoicism, and it aestheticizes them in a wonderful way. The aestheticization should remind you, by the way, of Marcus Aurelius, his lion's brow, his figs. In our next lecture, we're going to continue to discuss Zen and talk about the Zen account of awakening and what a realized life, a meaningful life, looks like from the Zen perspective. Stay tuned.